Thanks for saying hello and introducing yourselves.
Yeah, Jody, you don't need to be a traveler anymore to meet great people from all over the place. That's one of the very cool things right now.
Yeah. Ah, Helen from London. This is wonderful. It's that idea of the geography of my imagination.
There you go.
That's a little radical.
There's a lot of radical these days, which is why we're doing this presentation.
Yeah. Once you start using the word, that's a little preview, but I feel like I can't get away from it anymore. Now that we've been talking about it and writing about it and thinking about it, it's everywhere.
So we're going to go ahead and get started here in about 2 or 3 minutes. We had about close to 100 people sign up for each one of our sessions today. So we'll see how many decide to join us. The more the merrier, as always. And if you're just coming in, if you wouldn't mind just kind of saying hi in the chat, that would be great, just to let us know where you're from. And have to say we had, during the registration process, a lot of, as always, a lot of really great questions that people left as well. So
yeah.
Hopefully we'll try to answer some of those.
More from Melbourne. We have quite a contingency from Melbourne. It's amazing. And we saw in an earlier message, people are in stage 4 lockdown there. Hope you're all well. Yeah.
And apologies for the extra email that came out the day before, which was a little errant, but I think we got it straightened out. So
yeah, so we have a check-in from London, Ontario. We have London, England, and from the Kingdom of Bahrain. Welcome. Will and I are on the East Coast in the United States. I think we're going to get more Americans in our afternoon session, but
this is great. Sri Lanka. So like I said, I know we're at the top of the hour, but we're going to give it a couple more minutes just for people to drop in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And we're going to be very respectful of your time this morning. Should be pretty close to a 45-minute presentation, so we may hang a little bit afterwards to see if there are any questions that we can try to answer beyond that. But hey, John, good to connect with you again too. That conference in with IRCOS was wonderful.
I'm supposed to join an IRCOS conference in, I think it's April. We'll see if it happens. Oh, hey, Bridget. Welcome. I didn't know you were in the Netherlands. That's the lesson from having meetings with people on Zoom and then realizing where they actually are.
And hey, Simon, good to see you here from Portugal. I think Simon and I met in Vienna, maybe. I don't know. It gets a little crazy after a while, but I know we've met somewhere, I'm pretty sure. So about 1 more minute, and then we'll get into the formal part of the presentation, but we just always like acknowledging all the different places where people are coming from, and just kind of reading through the chat waterfall. So
I don't see anyone from Kansas yet, so we're waiting for that. We have Doha, welcome. Bahrain and Doha and UAE.
So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen.
Hey, Kieran from Brasilia. Great to see you here. Hope you're well. Ah, Josh, thank you for representing Kansas. We needed that.
Joss has a multinational state background, I think.
And some people, like our friend Jody, has just included a question that participants are welcome to answer. It's going to be a little tough for Will and I to be answering specific questions because we're about to begin, but welcome everyone who's just now joining.
Well, I think we should probably go ahead and get started officially. So welcome everyone. It's great to see so many familiar names. You almost said faces, but we're not in our regular Zoom Brady Bunch environment, but the names are great to see and new names as well from all around the world. And as always, that's what makes a lot of this work so stimulating and exciting right now, given these pandemic times that we're in. It still gives us an opportunity to connect and to learn with one another in some really great ways. So we want to welcome you to Imagining Radical Acts for Education. And this is an idea that Home and I have been kind of thinking about now for a few months, how this moment is somewhat radical on lots of different levels, but it also depends on how you define that word. And that what we really want to do today is think about that word and how we apply it to education. We chose this picture of the Freedom Schools because we really wanted to represent radical in a very positive way. That this is really about social change and really about cultural change as well. The Freedom Schools started as abolitionist schools in the 50s and 60s, and were really places that were student-centered and did a lot of things that a lot of people aspire to today. So thought that was a kind of a representative picture of the topic and also the kind of mood and the situation that we're in right now. We want to really try to just accomplish three things today. We want to see radical for what it really is. We want to, like I said before, kind of unpeel that word and really look at it and turn it over and try to figure out if it may not have a little bit of a different definition from what we usually use. We want to look at some examples of radical in education, and then we want to give you some practical radical starting points. And we have a fun little exercise, at least we think it's fun, that is a little bit playful at the end here, but that we think is pretty powerful in terms of getting you into some conversations that may actually lead to some radical rethinking of your work. So we wanted to start with this quote from Frederick Douglass again, because the situation in 1852 is similar to the situation that we find ourselves in today, not just in the United States, but around the world. And it is about this, the power of this moment and how we have to think about this moment. It's not the light that we need, it's the fire. It's not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. And I think a lot of us feel like we're in the midst of that right now. And we want to, again, as we have in past webinars and in our workshops, talk about this as an opportunity. We are in the midst of obviously something really powerful, something that is in many ways uncomfortable, but we want to try to find where the opportunity is, and we need kind of this crisis in a sense to try to make sense of how to move forward. So the first thing we want you to do in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, is to just look at that word radical and what's the first thing that comes to mind when you see that word. We're going to give you about a minute just to type in the chat fairly quickly. We have about 45 people in the room right now. So what comes to mind when you see that word? And we'll give it a couple seconds here to see hopefully some flow start in the chat.
Brave, from the root, change, breaking the mold, outlier, risk-taking, revolutionary, innovative, revolution, extremely different to the defined normal, change-making, charged up, fundamental change,
Yeah, these are great.
extreme, free radicals.
There's a math person, right?
Great, it's great. Antifa,
Interesting.
change. Outside, way outside the norm, embracing being uncomfortable, passion, cool, fundamental change, revolutionary, transformational, courageous,
That cool answer is kind of interesting, right? It's
unexpected. Yeah,
cool
yeah,
to
I'd
be
love to
radical
push on
sometimes.
that
Yeah.
a little. Why
So
is radical cool?
I
Is
think those
it the
responses,
font?
huh? Yeah, right. Maybe
Is
it's
it
the
the
font.
font?
I don't know. But I think those responses kind of capture the complexity of this word, right? They're a little bit all over the map, and they mean lots of different things in lots of different contexts. So again, we really want to try to situate this word in this moment, and we want to then try to apply it in maybe a little bit of a different way from the way you've been thinking.
Yeah, so thanks for the responses. It is really interesting when we talk to educators, friends, anybody, and you ask, what do you think of when you think of radical? We get this wildly divergent range of responses. And so different images, radical immediately evokes all these different images. Just keep going on the images. A lot of protesters, a lot of, sometimes even radical movements. A radical mastectomy, that's a part of the radical equation. It's clearly in math, but mostly I think in this current moment, a lot of people are thinking of different protest movements, and whatever you think about that, if oftentimes in the West, someone will see a picture like this last one of these women and not really understand what is at the root of what's happening in this picture. In this particular picture, this was from the Arab Spring from a number of years ago. These women are demanding democracy. So for someone who might feel maybe triggered in a negative way about radical, if you had a chance to stop and talk with these people in this protest, you may find much more in common than you would expect to. And so when we get to the meaning of radical, which we're about to, and explore, why does it divide us? Why is there so much fear associated? We've talked to educators who are like, please do not go there. And so today we want to really go there. So Angela Davis, who was thought of as a radical, she really illuminated. She says radical simply means grasping at the roots. And that's what we want to get to. And so when we think about innovation and change in education, let's think about transformational opportunity, grasping at the roots. So the number one definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary is of relating to or proceeding from a root, like in a plant, at the base of a stem, in linguistics, in math. This was interesting, this designed to remove the root of a disease. Here we are in the midst of a pandemic, and radical has a connection to getting to the root of the disease. And yes, it means fundamental, and it can also mean extreme. But the first definition is really interesting, and that's where we're sort of going to be keeping our focus. Angela Davis also said, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. So this, to us, we have been using this quote a lot as this sort of explanation and illumination of an iterative process. We have to do it all the time, and think about this transformation coming from the roots. It's not top down, and it's really at the base of what we are, I think, all of us are deeply yearning for, this profoundly human experience. So as we think about radical acts for education, there are some big questions. So first, and these are related to each other. Is this a perfect time? Or some in education would say it's an impossible time to consider addressing the goals or the problems or the challenges that are at the root of our schools. So do you think this is the perfect time or an impossible time because there's just too much to deal with? And to kind of explore what is the tension between being in a survival mode and versus taking advantage of this moment to try to get radical. So we recognize there is this tension. There is a lot to be done in schools. You are already experiencing such an intense moment where there is so much transition. I mean, you know, we always say we don't want to be the ones who talk about the distance between the desks and the barriers that you put up with the plexiglass. And I love the answers. I said I wasn't going to look at the YouTube, but the responses overwhelmingly, and I think we have a selective audience here, everyone says it is the perfect time to be considering these big questions. Yes.
It's about time too. I love that
and
one.
It's about time. Yeah. So this idea that the pandemic is already pulling at the root of education. There is a lot that is wrong with our schools around the world, and it is really coming to the surface. And when it comes to the surface, you know, after a storm, it's a lot easier to pull out the roots. I do a lot of weeding in my garden, and the storm is that opportunity to sort of weed out what you don't need. And so never wasting an opportunity that the crisis brings. So it's hard, and we don't want to discount how hard it is right now. But it is that tension of a moment of crisis that we also find ourselves in. So we really think about this pandemic as a portal, and we talk about this idea a lot. It's in our blog at thebigquestions.institute, where we talk about the pandemic is a portal. Pandemics over history have offered opportunities to think about the world anew. And so Arundhati Roy, in this fantastic essay, talks about the pandemic as a portal or a gateway. It is this threshold that we can walk through, and we get to imagine what we are going to carry with us. So as we think about getting radical, we can think about, as she talks about, are we going to drag the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our dead ideas? Are we going to drag those carcasses through the portal with us, or we get to rethink this moment and walk through lightly with little luggage? So this idea of going to the roots and doing it over and over again is kind of a way to think about repacking our luggage through this portal of the pandemic. What are we going to carry with us? And over this short webinar, we're going to get to talk and explore a little bit about the various radicals that we are going to carry. So if you think about, in the chat, please share. And I love this chat waterfall, has been amazing. I am reading it as much as I can as I speak. But answer this question if you can. What are some aspects of education where you might begin, or maybe you are already in the process? I see we have some really innovative educators here who are already thinking about, where might you get radical in terms of pulling at the root? What might you weed out, or what might you plant in this kind of fertile soil of this moment? Or maybe it's time to make your environment kind of more fertile to grasp and plant what goes there next. So this kind of unlearning and learning, yes. So people are thinking about the timetable of school, the place of learning, the opportunity that's in the chaos. What are the outcomes and the tools for learning? Absolutely. So just, you know, think about this, keep writing answers for what aspects of education might you get radical about. Sort of use this as a moment if you need to close your eyes and dream a little bit imagine where this portal of pandemic might take us to grasp at the roots.
And I'll give you a minute or so just to add some those thoughts to the chat, which are coming in now in terms of student voice and really looking at our values. That portal metaphor, like Homa said, is something that we do use a lot, but we really feel it too. We really do feel like we are moving in through a time where so much of what we do in everything is being put on the table and kind of inspected. And certainly that's happening in education in a lot of ways. Josh, that's a big one. What are teachers for? What is the role of a teacher in school? Basically, how do we see our roles in every aspect of schools, whether that's a leadership role or in a classroom, in an administrative building, on a board, even as parents. And what is the purpose of schooling? So again, as Homa said, keep putting those in the chat and keep engaging in the chat, which is something that we're trying to use a little bit more in this webinar, actually, because we know that this is a kind of a complex term, as we said, and we want to know what kind of is in your minds about it. So I want to talk a little bit about how radical is kind of happening already. This isn't something that is new to education, but as a lot of you in the chat earlier said, despite that this may seem like the perfect time to do this, there's still a lot of resistance. There's still a lot of schools that find it very difficult, as many of you mentioned again in the chat, that it's scary and it's really hard work. And the definition isn't very clear in terms of what radical looks like in terms of change. So I want to just talk about what it looks like in general right now in terms of education, what it looks like specifically in some traditional schools that are trying to do things differently, and then also talk about a lot of schools that are kind of could be considered to be radical schools because they're being built for kind of a different idea of what schools should be. I think from a movement standpoint, and again, this is an example we use quite a bit, but because it's such a great example of schools coming together, collaborating and teaming to say that grades really aren't great measures of what kids know, that tests in their traditional sense really aren't working very well, and that mastery.org has gotten, I think, 300 or 400 schools now to come up with a very different way of showing what children know and what they can do in schools. And it's a pretty radical, pulling at the root departure from the way that we think about assessment in traditional senses. There's this kind of radical movement, if you will, again, pulling at the root of what schools look like and act like given the pandemic, because basically a lot of people now are iterating on the edges, and they're saying, we don't really want to send our kids back to school in the current environment. We don't think it's safe or whatever else. So let's try to come up with all sorts of alternatives. And some of these are pretty effective. Others are challenging in terms of equity and in terms of other issues, that not all children have access to alternatives. So there's that conversation that's going to bubble up as well around this. And then there's this whole kind of interesting abolitionist teaching movement that has been pretty much situated in places in schools of color and by educators like Bettina Love, who has written a really great book about, we want to do more than survive. And it's interesting to hear her talk. And in her book, she actually, in an interview I saw, someone asked her, do you want to abolish schools? And she said, well, yeah, basically, we really want to create new ways of thinking about school. She has a quote in the book where she talks about this is more than reimagination. It's more than empowerment. Her quote is, we don't really want to reimagine slavery. We want to just have a whole new way of thinking about how we act in the world and how children experience school in the world. So basically, a lot of really big questions in this conversation as well. And to me, one of the most important ones is, what would freedom really look like in our schools? I mean, what if kids and teachers were really free to do things that were meaningful to them, that were relevant to them, that they had a passion or interest around. Lots of really interesting questions. And again, these are all kind of movements that are happening right now. And it reminds me of a book by Paul Hawken called Blessed Unrest, where he talks a lot about how there are all these environmental movements that are happening kind of under the surface. I think there are a lot of educational movements now that are kind of coming together in this moment that are pushing the conversations in some really interesting and powerful ways. And that's just a kind of a sampling of those. It's already happening in schools, in the way that schools function, and also in our expectations. I think this is a big deal, you know, that University of California has said, we're not going to do the SAT. Doesn't mean they're not going to test, they're going to come up with something different. But I just think the pushback against this multi-billion-dollar enterprise that is the ETS and you know, the whole narrative that goes around that is a really radical thing. It really pulls again at the root, and I'll stop saying that. But you know, that's really, I just want to, as a reminder, you know, just talk about the ways that these schools and these outside agencies are really changing things. Del Lago Academy in New Mexico basically is doing badges, and this is a badge that this young man got on. Earned on biotech, on spectrophoto, I don't even know how to pronounce that word, right? But basically it was about his passion or his interest in understanding how much caffeine was in a bottle of Purple Rain, which is a power drink, an energy drink. And again, freedom to pursue things on his own terms. And our friends at Nipmuc up in Massachusetts, who are really thinking hard about the narratives that they tell. And I'll just tell one quick story from John Clemens, who's the principal there, who got a little bit radical by saying, you know, it's great that you become a merit semi-finalist or a merit scholar, but we get to choose the stories that we tell. And that's not the story we're going to tell any longer on our blog or in our you know, news, in the news that we share out, because we really are now more focused on what kids can do, the problems they're solving, the ways that they're collaborating. It's a pretty powerful way of thinking about this. Templestowe College outside of Melbourne, I know we have a whole bunch of folks from Melbourne here, which basically has been looking at just changing the culture and changing the dynamic, and has used yes as the default policy, meaning, you know, we start with yes. And this is echoes Pam Moran, one of my favorite former superintendents from Virginia, who also had this idea of, well, let's start with yes. Let's say yes to everything, unless we just simply can't do it. And so there are lots of schools, again, the traditional schools that are beginning to think a little bit differently around that. Where this is really kind of blowing up, though, is in new schools. I've been in this space now for about 15 years, trying to engage schools and educators in change conversations. It's been really, really difficult. And over the last 5 years, though, I've been simply amazed by how many different schools are appearing out there on the edges, but now those edges are kind of moving into the center more and more. So you have schools like Brightworks out in San Francisco, where it's pretty much kids, what do you want to learn about? How do you want to learn it? And how can we help you do that? We have our friends at the Avenues School, which has come up with the Avenues World Elements. And I just think this is such a powerful way of representing what's important. If you look at each one of these, and you can, again, go find these, but if you look at each one of these, they are basically a skill or a piece of knowledge that kids are supposed to master. And for each one, you can dive into and you can see how they define it, what it means, and then what the learning outcomes are. And they're very, very difficult from traditional curriculum, very different from the way that we think about these are the things that kids need to learn, how they need to learn them, you know, the pathways and all of that other stuff. One Stone is a school out in Idaho, which again is just a very radically different way of thinking what the school experience is. It is totally student-led and directed. Kids have a lot of agency in terms of the decisions that are made about policies, about budgets, all that kind of stuff. And basically they talk about it being a radical reinvention of learning, which I think is pretty interesting. And then again, you know, one of our favorites is the big picture schools that basically have been growing around the world. I know that there are big picture schools in Australia, all across the United States, in Europe, in South America. And it is, again, about thinking differently about how we situate kids in the experience of school. So it really is about designing their own school experience. Josh, you asked, what's the question about the role of teachers. It's a very different sense of what teachers do in classrooms as coaches and mentors. And I just love the last line of this that says, we are all activists. We are activists. And we are actively trying to change the world, to make the world a better place. And that's the work that our kids are engaged in. But we're also activists in the context of education, where we're trying to give kids lots of different ways of thinking about the ways that they can learn in the world. So there's lots of radical happening when it comes to education, but I don't want to discount the difficulty of doing this. And again, those last examples were built to be radical in the way that we're talking about it here today. And I've come to the conclusion, I say this a lot, that it is almost easier to build for radical than it is to change to be radical in a traditional school. It's very, very difficult to take decades, if not centuries, of legacy language, legacy norms, legacy practice, legacy cultures, and move them to a place. And again, a number of you have already said that in the chat, that it's a very difficult undertaking, and we just want to honor that. But we do want to now kind of suggest ways that you may find some entry points into being radical that don't bite off the whole elephant, if you know what I mean, right? That aren't necessarily about creating something totally different or changing something that's been around for a long time, transforming it, but maybe places that you can begin to think about some deeply radical conversations in your schools.
Yeah, so, and I want to also mention in terms of the examples, and it came up in the chat a little bit. So when we share these examples, a lot of them have elements of radical thinking and radical transformation, even if they are not perfect models. And so we feel like, like that metaphor of the elephant, we're sort of feeling around in a dark room. There is something huge in here, and we are trying to figure out the best path forward. So these different examples start to illuminate segments that might work and help us get our thinking going. And so we want to share some different entry points to thinking radically and breaking that down in so many ways, because it is giant. A few years ago, I heard a story that really moved me. It was the story of a white nationalist youth who had an incredible influence on the United States and on the racist white nationalist movement. And this is the story of Derek Black, who now a lot of you have heard of. The long story short, please learn about his story. It's a fascinating story of transformation. He essentially was isolated from anyone that was different from him his entire life, deliberately by his family, in order to grow in a movement of hate, which he then became a leader of. But it only took a few weeks of dinners with the one Jewish student in his school who observed a Shabbat dinner every Friday night. And over the course of a few weeks that transformed his entire worldview and his outlook, it made me think about an idea that is radical hospitality. It's such a simple idea, but it made me think about what happens when you stick that word radical in front of something as simple as, or as it's sort of hospitality. It feels nice, it feels benign, it feels very gentle and polite. But when you put radical in front of hospitality, that word starts to transform. And so then this started this process in my imagination of what happens when you stick radical in front of other polite, nice words like kindness. What does radical kindness look like? Radical hope, radical empathy, radical imagination. Aren't we supposed to be practicing, not just imagining? And like Will mentioned, Bettina Love says, I don't want to just reimagine. I don't want to reimagine slavery. I want to radically imagine the outlook of that entire ecosystem. And so let's think about, where might you stick the word radical in front of another noun, adjective, whatever the grammars of radical are. Radical what? So like that radical hospitality that just transforms this word. In the chat, start to write down a few ideas around what you might imagine. Radical what? Complete the phrase. Radical wellness. Keep them coming as fast as it comes to mind. Radical what? Radical art making. Radical optimism. Love it. What does radical optimism feel like? Radical learning, radical curiosity. So there's curiosity, and then there's radical curiosity. How do you grasp at the roots of curiosity? Radical learning, radical commitment. Are kids going to walk into a radical classroom? Might your Zoom be a radical classroom? Radical growth, radical passion, radical individuality, radical spirituality. I'm not sure what radical individuality is. That one may make me a little uncomfortable, honestly, but that's where having the opportunity to explore these words, so I understand, what do you mean by that? Radical inclusion, radical charity, radical questioning, self-worth. Keep them coming, because this is amazing. There is not a lot of overlap with a list that we made. So this is, there's a quote about what we considered, this looks like radical inclusion, that Jesse Stummel wrote about. He said, we have to design for the least privileged, most marginalized students, the ones more likely to have felt isolated even before the pandemic, who are the disabled students, the chronically ill students, Black students, queer students, and those facing housing and food insecurity. We need to write policies and imagine new ways forward for these students, the ones who are already struggling, already facing exclusion. What might radical inclusion looks like? So you kind of need to sit with it. And I'm seeing other words like radical trust, radical sustainability, radical listening. So here are a few radicals that we have sort of dreamed. And you think about, what might radical empathy look like? Radical hope, radical wellness, inclusion. How about radical inquiry? Belonging, candor. Can you have a staff meeting where one of the ground rules is radical candor? What do you need before you get to that point? I think that's you gotta develop a profound level of trust before you get to that point. But how do you start to build a community? I honestly almost think like this group that's in our chat right now, it's almost developing such a stimulating trust that you are already employing a radical lens. So we started to imagine all these radicals and then thought, okay, what if we start to apply that to very specific experiences in the culture of a school, in the running of a school? So if we start to generate randomly, stick a few words together, radical belonging and school curriculum. So if you were to apply, just sit with that word, radical belonging, in what you teach. How is that going to change the books you read? How is that going to change the projects that you sort of unleash, that you allow your students to take part in? Radical belonging. I think it's going to unleash, somebody just mentioned radical creativity. I think it is going to unleash that. If I feel like I can bring my whole self to the table in the canon that we are reading. I think that's going to mean I am also going to see myself in the curriculum. I am not going to be silenced. What about radical wellness as you develop a budget for your school? How is that going to change every single line item? And in your school budget, applying radicals like radical inclusion, radical empathy, radical wellness to every single line item, is that going to change the way you decide to spend the precious resources that are available to you? It really starts to kind of get the imagination going. And this, we really think, is the time to do that. So we came up with this funny acronym. We've been thinking about radical acts for education. And we thought about, what if we had sort of a random generator of words? So a random radical acts generator for education. Rage, apply all your rage to this random generator. And in the chat, think about this. If you randomly picked out of a hat or spun a wheel and landed on a word like radical love, that's the big one. Radical acceptance, radical self-care, radical equity, and you then spun the second wheel or picked out of a hat a second list of words from the second column. So budget, facilities. How do you apply radical empathy to decisions about your facilities in your school opening? What might that look like? Radical listening in the new vision and mission, your strategic plan. Are you practicing radical inclusion or radical listening or thinking about radical wellness? Any of the radicals applied to any of these grammars of school. To sustainability plans, to community building. Who is in your community? Who do you consider? How do you involve parents in a fresh way that really grasps at the root? What do you carry in your light luggage through the portal? Do these words in the random generator of radical acts help you to think through? So in the chat, you can begin to think about and write down, what radical act might you want to think about? How do you generate a radical blank, fill in the word, for whatever that grammar of school is?
Love that first one. Radical inclusion for assessment. Yeah, perfect.
Look at that.
Right? So that would be something a really interesting conversation to have, I think. And that's kind of the point here, right? That as you kind of mix and match these, they lead to some pretty interesting questions and some maybe discomfort, some healthy discomfort. So what might be some others? We have radical candor for learning.
Radical listening for your parents and your community. Right. So if you are radical listening, for one example, there are so many parents whose first language is not the dominant language of your school, such as English. How do you practice radical listening with those families who might not feel fully included, or who work during the day and can't attend the meeting that you've scheduled? How do you practice radical listening with them? What does radical self-care for meetings look like? I love that. Radical self-care, by the way, is a really important component in the abolitionist teaching network. In the abolitionist work, I think it's Audre Lorde who talks about radical self-care for those who are working for deep equity and justice, because this is tiring. The work of education is constant and tiring as well. How do you practice radical self-care in that equation?
And, don't feel limited by these lists either, right? So there's someone who wrote, Kathy wrote, radical creativity for progression, right? So the idea here again is just to get your brains kind of thinking differently about a lot of those, as Homer referred to them, grammars of school that are kind of old and moldy in a lot of ways, and that we probably haven't reflected on very specifically in the context of a lot of these words as well. So we want to be respectful of your time today. For us, at least, I think I can say those 45 minutes flew by pretty quickly. Just want to leave you with a quote, and then we have some really interesting things coming up that we want to share with you. And so just at the end of this, going back to someone who was probably one of the most radical thinkers in education, Paulo Freire, who had a great quote in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he says, "The more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality, so that knowing it better, he or she can transform it. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled." And we just love that quote because it suggests the ways that we have to enter into these conversations. We have to go to our own root. We have to be willing to be looking at our own kinds of biases and, you know, the ways that we see the world as well, and be radical thinkers about ourselves. And the more that we can do that, I think the more that we can enter into these conversations in really, really powerful ways. So I'm just going to turn it over to Homa to talk a little bit real fast about some stuff that we have upcoming. The first one here is really exciting and can't wait for this one actually, but Homa, go ahead.
We're so excited. And you know what, before I mention that, I just want to also say, you know, in this process of honoring each of you, every educator, whether you're joining live or watch this afterwards in a recording, perhaps the most important one that Paulo Freire talks about, that is at the root of what we're talking about, is radical love. And also practicing that for yourself. And even after this webinar, taking a moment for yourself, for your radical self-care, to breathe, to imagine, to dream, to remember why you do this. We get so busy that we don't have time for the most important conversations and the most important care of ourselves, our loved ones, to feel energized to do this again. So we have had really the honor of dreaming and also creating incredible partnerships at the Big Questions Institute. We are just getting started, and our next free webinar we are so excited about will be in partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Teaching Tolerance, tolerance.org, which is an amazing resource for educators that a lot of you may be getting a lot of materials from. We are going to be helping launch this new podcast series called Sounds Like Hate. And we're going to be specifically focused on the episodes that are specifically about education. We'll be looking at the challenges of building equity and justice inside a school as one school case study in Vermont that we'll be talking with the directors, producers, the principal from that school, and the senior writer at Teaching Tolerance will join us on September 24th. We're going to have it at 2 times. Please tell your friends. Please sign up at bigquestions.institute. It's free, and it's going to be fascinating to go behind the scenes to kind of hear the stories of how you tell the story of equity inclusion, and then how we can move forward in some very difficult environments where there is clear resistance, and you know, kind of join on this journey with people who have been thinking really deeply about it.
And just a quick note, we finalized this yesterday, so our registration page isn't up yet, but you'll be notified if you said yes to getting our emails. And if not, you can still go back to our site, just hang out there. I think it's for 7 or 8 seconds. You get a little pop-up box that you can get on the list if you like as well.
Yeah, so people on our email list will get all the information. And then we had a 5-webinar series over the summer that was kind of mind-blowing for us and the participants. 5 weeks of framing and thinking big and radically imagining new leadership lenses for a post-pandemic world. Some of you talked about getting out of the factory model of education. That's exactly what this is about. So over 4 weeks, starting on October 7th, we meet once a week. And we have a limited number of educators and leaders who join Will and me on this sort of journey of building new lenses for education. We also have some offerings, shorter offerings, short session, a 90-minute webinar on futures thinking for educational leaders. And whether you consider yourself a leader or not, you're welcome to join this introduction to scenario planning for during and after the crisis. So how do you get launched doing some futures thinking and scenario planning? That's on September 26th, 2 times in 1 day. And then we're going to run our 2-day workshop on Deeper Than Diversity that Eric Dozier and I run, which is, again, it's sort of transformational, radical inclusion and belonging principles in the quest for racial justice at a range of schools. So these are all coming up end of September, first week of October. Kind of check back in for updates, but we are excited to share this thinking that is really unfolding, all this new content, and we appreciate you for spending this 45 minutes with us this morning. So if you want to stay, we will, this is the official end, but it's really easy to get in touch directly with Will and me, and also on our social media. And if people, if there are any questions in the chat, we will do our best for a couple minutes to answer those. But thank you so much. And thanks for sort of helping us open our radical thinking and radical learning as well.
Thanks very much, everyone. Go be radical. So we will hang out for a couple minutes. And if anyone has any questions in the chat, we got a radical thank you. That's always nice.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And if you do have any questions, just put them in the chat.
Appreciate all the gratitude. It's feeling like radical gratitude.
Thanks.
One thing, Will, that's interesting about using this word is that we don't want to overuse it and lose the meaning. That's another thing. Like, even as I just said, radical gratitude.
We should go back and count. We should go back and count and see how many times we use radical in this presentation. I bet you.
Yeah.
At least 50 or so, right?
Yeah. But it is interesting, introducing a new idea, but not losing the meaning and the power by overdoing it.
Right.
So,
yep. Interesting. All right. Well, we'll give it about another minute or so, and if there aren't any questions, then we'll sign off.
Any other reading for radical educators?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of reading for radical educators, right?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, certainly anything, well, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I think is probably
start with
number
that.
one. Yeah. Hybrid Pedagogy as well is a site online though that I highly recommend. It's a little bit more for higher ed, but it's very accessible for K through 12 teachers as well. And there's
even
just
reading the foreword.
Yeah, there's tons of stuff to read there as well. But certainly, if you really want to get to the root, John Holt, Bell Hooks, yeah, there's a ton of stuff out there.
And also go on the Abolitionist Teaching Network site. Yep. They have a big reading list, videos, resources for that specific area of radical thinking.
All right. So if there aren't any other questions, I think we'll bring this session to an end. Thanks again, everyone who's kind of hanging out for being here, and sincere best wishes on your work moving forward.
Thank you.